What's up, guys? Thanks for watching. Would appreciate a like, subscribe, comment down below. Would love to see you engage, and thanks for watching. So potentially my favorite person that I've been listening to over, I would say probably the past 6 months, up until he spoke at Mark Driscoll's men's gathering every single week. His men's ministry, Real Men, is Steve Deace. I've talked about Steve a couple times in the show, and I think Steve is unbelievably smart. He was a very close friend of Charlie's, and Steve is I believe to be one of the most important voices currently in America, particularly for the Protestant evangelical Christian men's movement. I think that he's a wonderful man. I really hope to meet him in the future. And Steve, if you ever watch this, I keep going, dude. You're doing great stuff. And he delivered such a powerful tribute to Charlie after he was assassinated 2 weeks ago, and it really hit Steve very hard. And Steve was just a mess for a couple of days, to be honest. And now he, like many others in this movement of rising, and Steve is a middle-aged guy. I believe he's in his early 50s, but he is championing this exact point that Charlie was trying to make. And so, obviously, Steve has his own show on the Blaze TV. By the way, the Blaze TV is the best, by far, independent conservative media company in the world outside of TCN. And so if you're looking for anyone, please subscribe to the Blaze. It's awesome. And so like Glenn Beck and Sarah Gonzalez and all the people over there, they're great. And so anyway, but Steve has a show there. It's on every day, I believe, at 11 Central, 12 Eastern. I try to listen to it as much as I possibly can. And so especially after this horrible incident with Charlie. But anyways, so the day after Charlie was killed, Glenn Beck had a rotation of Blaze TV media personalities come on who all knew Charlie very well. And Charlie did several events with the Blaze. I think Glenn essentially viewed him as a son, and I believe Charlie looked up to Glenn as a father figure. And I know that because that's what Charlie said over and over again, I think in indirect ways, but I think that's a safe point to make. And so we had Steve on, and Steve was, again, just devastated, like everyone was. I remember I watched Glenn's entire stream, and I cried. Oh my God, I cried so much throughout that entire thing because I was so sad. And I was so sad because people like Steve and Glenn were sad, who I look up to very highly. And so Steve was invited on by Glenn to talk about Charlie and to talk about what needs to happen in the wake of Charlie's murder. And he made, I believe, one of the most profound points I've heard in the wake of the most devastating political assassination of the greater than a half century at least. And so he said that Gen X men failed Charlie Kirk. And Steve is a Gen X man. And so that was a big thing to say. And I was very curious when he said Gen X because, boomers have been targeted for criticism, Gen Z, millennials, but no one talks about Gen X. And I've always kind of wondered why that was, but I'd never heard someone bring it up before other than Steve. And so when he said that, I was like, oh, that's an interesting point. And so Glenn didn't have to ask him why because Glenn just let him go and Steve was sobbing in the middle of all this. And so he said that basically they are, and this is correct, by the way, they're the ones with the kids now out of the house. They're the ones with the discretionary income. They're the ones with the free time. But instead of stepping out in leadership and taking the mantle of the institutions of our country, deploying their capital, deploying their resources, stepping up in ministry, stepping up in basically the cultural institutions of families, of helping their children, etc. He basically said that they've checked out and they're just kind of listening to grunge and spending all their time, again, listening to Pearl Jam, going on vacation, not stepping into the community, not helping out, not helping restore the social fabric. And he compared that to Charlie, and Charlie, in theory, and I think this is correct also, Charlie had no logical reason to be doing all the things he was doing, flying to the White House, flying to Britain, he just got back from Japan, I believe, in the time he was assassinated, flying all over, being on college campuses. Charlie had 2 children under the age of 3. He was a young father. He had just gotten married, I think, 4 years ago. And when you're a young father, a young mother, you should not be in that position. There should be, this is the way healthy societies always work, by the way. If you are a young family, and Charlie, by the way, was, from all accounts, a very good, a very present father when he could be. But Charlie also had a massive organization to run. He had everything like this. And so Steve basically condemned and rebuked Gen X and said that basically Charlie should have never been in that position because people in Gen X should have taken that mantle from him. And I said, man, that's a very interesting point. That's a really insightful point, particularly because, as I mentioned, that the two largest generational groups in power in this country right now, I believe, are boomers and Gen Z. I think Gen Z we've woken up the world in terms of, oh, wow, like these kids that are coming up are like really value driven. They're really loud. They're really traditional. They really want to make noise, all that kind of thing. And then boomers are kind of the targets for everyone because, as Tim Dillon has, I think, rightly said, like they've destroyed everything good about the country. They're clinging to power, in positions of political leadership, business leadership. They're not handing down the reins to people to take over their points. And so, and then obviously the millennials are kind of the generation that everyone's like, oh yeah, like they're failures and no one wants to, no one in that generation wants to work, wants to do anything like that. And I think that's honestly kind of unfair. I think I've defended millennials a lot on my show. I think millennials got screwed over in many ways, but that's beside the point. So, but everyone talks about those generations, but no one talks about Gen X. And I always wondered why that was. And I'm just like, they're not there. They're not doing anything. That's why. Like at least millennials and Gen X were accused of just flopping on their faces, and boomers are accused of like, no one talks about Gen X because they're like invisible. They don't do anything. And I just was like, wow. When Steve brought that up, I was like, wow, like that is really, really fascinating. And it's really hurting our country. To Steve's point, it's really hurt America that Gen X, by the way, the only generation by voting data that put Donald Trump back in the White House. So they have the same values. And I was raised by two Gen Xers, my mom and my dad. My mom and my dad are Gen X, and I love them. They're great. But Gen X, along with a large number of young people, are the ones that delivered the election for Donald Trump and are the most conservative generation outside of Gen Z on record. But yet they're nowhere to be found. They're not vocal. They're not, like I see this in my church as well. And my church is a younger church, mind you. But I see a lot of millennials stepping up. I see a lot of boomers stepping up. I see a lot of young people stepping up. I see barely any Gen Xers stepping up. Same is true in companies. Hardly any of them. I think Steve hit on this, and I hit on this in my monologue with people that are just shameful, like Spencer Cox. This is particularly happening on the male side of the equation, particularly with Gen X men. And I've noticed this in just looking, and I'm not trying to throw shade at anybody, but I've noticed this in some of like my dad's friends, in some of the people that are, I'm seeing this like everywhere now that Steve brought it up, and I'm seeing it everywhere. I have noticed a malaise in Gen X men. Like they're very checked out, very checked out. They don't want anything to do with the social fabric. They don't want to volunteer in church. They don't want to step into political leadership. They don't want to run for office. They don't want to do anything. And again, Steve talked about this too. It's almost like they're too cool for school. Like someone else will take care of that. Not my problem. They're NMPs. That's what I call those people. Not my problem. Someone else will do it. Unacceptable in a democracy like ours. Unacceptable. And this mentality, someone else will take care of it. Someone else will run for office. Someone else will protect my church from descending into apostasy. Like someone else will send that email to the principal of the school. That is a corrosive and a dangerous mentality. A very corrosive and very dangerous mentality. And I've noticed this too because, so I'm Gen Z. I was raised by two Gen Xers. And my grandparents are the silent generation. They're the generation before the boomers. And so I've noticed this trend in terms of boomers raise millennials. Boomers and millennials are both wildly screwed up in multiple ways. But Gen X and Gen Z and the silent generation above them are really doing okay. And so I was wondering kind of like, and I've read a lot of Jean Twenge's work. She does phenomenal stuff on generational differences, and I highly recommend all of her stuff as well. She's great. But I think the common thing that Jonathan Haidt's written about this, Greg Lukianoff has written about this, lots of people have written about this, but what people have said about Gen Z for very long is that they want everything to be safe. That's true. I've noticed that with my own friends. I've noticed that with people that I work with in the corporate space. I've noticed it with people that I just know. They want things to be safe. They want their paycheck to come in every 2 weeks. They want to have a meal plan. They want to have an exercise routine. They want to have a normal routine. They want everything to be normal. And I think that's largely because Gen X wanted everything to be normal. And I think it's largely because the silent generation wanted everything to be normal. And by the way, like, I'm not against, I know I live a very unsafe, quote unquote, unsafe life in some ways. Like, I don't have, guaranteed income. I don't have any of that stuff. I don't have support of my health benefits, anything. And so Gen X has largely played it very safe as well. They played it very safe. They have not taken many risks, from what I can say generationally. And there's exceptions, obviously, but generationally, broad brushstrokes, they have not taken many risks. And this is good to some degree. Like this is good, I think, because in a way, because they valued stability. They valued raising a family in a safe home environment. They valued, routine and making sure their kids did well. Obviously, there's a horrific divorce rate among Gen X that screwed everything up. But for the families and the people that did this right, like, their kids are turned out really well, like really well. And so that's good. And I think the same is true with Gen Z right now. They're like, I'm not trying to, be a baller on Instagram or whatever. Like, I don't believe that I can just follow my dreams and I'll be okay in life, like whatever. And so on the flip side, however, it has caused a lot of Gen X men in particular, who are the primary breadwinners still, that's a trend that I've seen, and I think the data backs this up as well, that has caused a lot of them to not boldly step out in leadership. They have not challenged for positions of leadership. They have not said, I want this. They have not been ambitious enough in terms of putting themselves out there, which has allowed selfish older people, i.e. the boomers, to hold on to the reins of power, and for the younger generation to grow up without guidance, without wanting to strive, without wanting to put themselves out there. And I think this is a very loaded term, but I think it's the correct one. The biggest way this comes out for Gen X is through passivity. And Gen X men is through passivity. They just don't seem to care as much. Again, they go, that's not my problem. Like, someone else will take care of that. Oh, whatever. And again, not all Gen X men, but a lot of them. And this is wrong. And this is sinful, I believe, especially as a man. Because God created men for dominion. And now weak men, because strong men, and I think Gen X is largely a group of very strong men in multiple ways, to give them some credit, have allowed weak men to take over institutions, which then, obviously, because weak leadership dictates the course of anything, a family, a company, a church, etc., they have driven them into the ground, our institutions, because they, Gen X men, didn't do what the prophet Ezekiel said and stand in the gap. They didn't have the nerve to stand up and stop this cultural decay that we have been facing over the longest time. Because they largely share our values in Gen Z, because they raised us. This is who we are. This is who Gen X is. This is who the silent generation is. And so this, and that's how we get men like Spencer Cox. That's exactly how we get men like Spencer Cox. And you look at all of the blech, the milk toast, the off-white, just men that are in positions of leadership, like the governor of Utah, where Charlie Kirk was just shot. And it's like, we have to do better. There's got to be something better than that, right? And there is. And there is. There are other men of that generation that can step up and lead. But they haven't. And the problem with that, Steve Deace, among other people, has charged them with, hey, you got to step up and lead. The problem is they don't have the time. It's too late for them, largely. And I'm not saying you can't run for office or start a company in your 50s or late 40s or whatever, early 60s. I think that's the gap. But it's a lot harder. So the bottom line of this is that if Gen X does not step up, then Gen Z is just going to do it for them. Like, we're not going to wait anymore. You already killed Charlie. We're not going to wait anymore. We're not going to ask permission anymore. We're just going to do it. And we've seen this betrayal of a lack of leadership, a lack of dominion, a lack of authority across all of our generations. And now it's just becoming worse and worse. And we're just not going to take it anymore. I've talked to too many people. We're just not going to take it anymore.